disruptive versus evolutionary versus incremental innovation, because let's focus on larger companies where, again, it's easy to say, right? It's very hard to go through all the levels of approval, through all the hierarchical steps which exist in most companies. Not every company is Amazon and Google. Okay, many companies built in very hierarchical way, and that's where innovation, we know, struggles. All right. So what you're advising to your client? What's the best approach? Where does innovator go?
So for me, the absolute key is to create some experiments, such as people do not have any opinion anymore on a project or an idea, but they have some facts and data. So, and for me, this is a magic bullet, the magic wand, whatever we can say it. Every time I have been using experimentations in order to provide this kind of validation, it worked. Or if it didn't work, then it was a good time to forget about the project. Okay, so better to validate anyway. And this is the one of the methods which is used, which has been called lean startup for entrepreneur, but it can be used inside big companies as well to validate issues. I've been using this from very small companies to larger companies, and in both cases it works. And we've got some examples in the industry which are pretty known. If you take, for instance, big companies like SpaceX. Okay, SpaceX, Elon Musk has designed from the start a budget for experiments, and I would have we could say failure, but it's not the case actually. Experiments to learn how to make things working without putting at risks the payloads of the rockets, which includes some human in some cases. And typically, when you look at what has been done by SpaceX, they started to make some tests with the rockets just to control every aspect of the launch and landing back on Earth. And you see in the videos which have been published that they start with igniting the rocket and stop it. So they control the rocket. Then they make 2 or 3 meters and they come back. And then they go up to maybe 50 meters. And then the rocket is staying at the same level in a stationary flight, at the exact same level, and then come back and land. So even rockets could use experimenting in order to validate the approach. Now, if I go to very small companies and very small companies who are handled by entrepreneurs, they're in the same situation. They can validate their ideas. I have a friend who is a specialist of sales. He's a speaker as well, and he's a specialist of sales. And he explained that he did an experiment with one of his friends owning a restaurant on how to sell drinks in the restaurant. And they did what we call some cohorts. So basically, the first cohort was the first week where they didn't propose anything to customers. And then they recorded the number of drinks that were ordered by customers just before the meals. And then they started to ask a question. Second week, they started to ask a question. Would you like to have a little drink? And then we see a jump of sales of 27%. The third week, the question was different, was what would you like as a drink? Which makes the assumption they wanted to have something, okay? Mm-hmm. And then sales are jumping up to 37% if I remember well. Up to the end, which is week 5 or 6, in which they say, okay, we have a specific cocktail designed by our mixologist specialist, or maybe you want something else as a drink. And then sales are jumping up to 77%. So even in a restaurant, you can experiment to validate some ideas and how to increase your sales or your retention, this kind of stuff. There is absolutely no limit as soon as you try to experiment.
Wonderful. It's called consultative sales, right? It's called when seller becoming part of the customer experience and based on, of course, on knowledge about the customer. Yes, that's where data come in, right? So larger company, right, should not act blindly. They should know who they target and what's the best way to experiment. Otherwise, again, nobody has endless funds. So let's talk about some return on investment.
The key point when it's a failure, it's because you didn't make the right experiment in order to validate the project to start with. Okay, the rule that we have, and I was speaking about Lean Startup a little bit earlier, which is Lean Startup is the methodology which is used by entrepreneurs to create a startup. Okay, in a way which is very lean and efficient. The same principle is being used by big companies, and I can take the example of Google, which has been using a method. I think let me explain it. Let me explain the concept, but it is very similar to Lean Startup. The concept is the following: let's say you have a project which is to have a monkey giving a talk. Actually, who is going to say a play of Shakespeare. Piece on the top of pedestal. You say that pedestal in English? Of a pedestal which is, let's say, 8 feet high. Where do you start? Do you start to build the pedestal because it's easy to do? It's easy to do, so you can say, okay, let's do it such as it is done, and we don't have to take care of that anymore, right? So many people will say that. Actually, the strategy being used is monkey first. Why? Because if you cannot have your monkey starting to speak, the entire project collapses. So there is no need to do the pedestal. So it means you're going to start with the most difficult part, such as you're going to de-risk the project by taking the first most difficult part. You are creating an experiment to validate the most difficult part. And from you learn from this experiment, you will decide if you continue or if you change the project or if you stop the project.
How interesting. In the US, we call this approach the opposite, low-hanging fruit. You know, you start with project, which is the easiest, less mission critical. Okay, you experiment in the areas where your business is not depending on every second, you know, for every customer. You start with easy way and you demonstrate success and then you progress.
Okay, so which could be another track as well, and which has to be used in some cases. So there is no point about that. But the point, let's say you have a very new project and you want to get a full understanding of that. This is definitely a way to go. So you will start with this most difficult part. And once you have experimented on that, you will go to the next one, the next most difficult part. So if your project cannot work because it is impossible to make it work, and this is why it's called monkey first, because obviously it's very difficult to have a monkey speaking and acting on Shakespeare, then it's better to stop as early as possible. So if you have to fail, it's better to know it as early as possible, which gives you some bandwidth to try on another project. So if you are failing on a project that comes to fruition, I mean, if you go through a full implementation of a project and you have not tested the most critical part, today this is foolish. So a project that should not happen to the market definitely should be stopped as early as possible. And I've seen crazy projects like that. I've seen crazy projects in the Silicon Valley that should have never gone to the market, but still people have been funded by investors. It's really amazing. So and so it was not the technology usually which was the issue, by the way. It was what we call the product market fit, meaning that the product had no market, basically.